Hello, my name is Vanessa Maydew. I am Communications and Knowledge Exchange Specialist for Livestock, the Center for Supporting Evidence-Based Interventions in Livestock. Welcome to our second Livestock Data Summer Session. This month, the Livestock Data for Decisions, or LD4D Community of Practice, is hosting a series of learning events to showcase the work of our members. The LD4D summer sessions will offer unique insights into tools, techniques, and opportunities with plenty of time for interaction. These 1-hour sessions are aimed at researchers, project implementers, industry, and funders who work in livestock development. So without further ado, I introduce our first speaker, Simon Fraval. He is a research fellow at the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Security at the University of Edinburgh. Simon is an economist with over 10 years of experience in agricultural and food systems research and has a PhD from Wageningen University. He also spent time at ILRI in East Africa, working on issues around dairy sector development, payment for environmental services, environmental impact assessment, and gender equity. His current fellowship seeks to harness existing data frameworks and networks in pursuit of efficient and sustainable food production in low and middle income countries. Also with us is Professor Alan Duncan, a livestock feed specialist with ILRI and a visiting professor at the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Security. So a quick note on format. We'll have a 5-minute introduction from Alan, and then Simon will present for 10 to 15 minutes. Anytime during the session, you may type your questions or comments in the chat. After the presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer, and then we'll break out into discussion breakout groups for 20 to 25 minutes. So I will just swap to Alan's slides, one moment. Okay, good. Over to you, Alan.
Okay, thanks, Vanessa. Hi, everyone. Can people hear me? Maybe a thumbs up or something, just to check before I launch in. Yeah, good. So thanks, Vanessa, and thanks everyone for joining. The main man this morning is Simon. He's going to speak about what's called the FEAST Global Data Repository, but just to provide a little bit of background to the FEAST tool in general, before we kick off with that, I was going to just share a few slides. So Vanessa, the next slide, please. So first thing to say is that feed is a key issue in developing world livestock systems, as I'm sure you all know. I mean, it's kind of the #1 cost for smallholder farmers in terms of feeding their animals. And unless you get feed right, then many other interventions don't really work. So feed is often kind of described as a key constraint in smallholder livestock systems. Next slide, please. However, when people think about feed in smallholder systems, very often the solutions that are presented are what I would call researcher-driven solutions. They're not necessarily suitable for the local context. They don't necessarily deal with the key constraints in smallholder systems. Often farmers and other local stakeholders aren't really involved in their selection and design. And they often don't really take account of wider system constraints such as labor and markets and that kind of thing. And as a result, next slide, please. As I've traveled around the developing world, I often come across examples of child interventions. So well-meaning researchers delivering solutions without necessarily having understood the local context. Here's an example from India where these fodder blocks had been lying in a barn for a long time. They look great, but they're not being used. Next slide, please. Similarly, here's a fodder chopper lying unused in India. You can see the rust on it. Again, probably brought in by a well-meaning NGO or project without really understanding what farmers need. And so it becomes next. So in response to that, we sensed a demand for a more kind of systematic way of coming up with livestock feed interventions. And we developed something called the feed assessment tool, FEAST, which is essentially a systematic approach to assessing the feeding context for livestock production in smallholder systems. It looks wider than just feed, so it sets feed in a wider context. It involves farmers and local stakeholders in the process. And it's a lot about asking the right questions to farmers in a structured way in order to tease out what would work best in terms of feed interventions. Next slide, please. So FEAST has been ongoing for a long time. I think we first came up with the idea in about 2008 or something like that. And it's gradually evolved over the years and become a bit of a kind of a kind of set of tools, I suppose. So there's the kind of FEAST process itself, which is a question guide and a household survey. We run focus group discussions. We run a simple kind of household survey among a limited number of farmers. We've also developed intervention fact sheets, which are kind of linked to FEAST, which give background on various feed interventions. We've developed a data app where the information collected through the household survey can be entered, and it generates standardized graphical outputs which describe the livestock feed system. And then the most recent one is what we're talking about today, which is this global data repository. So having collected all that household data across many countries, we realized that that was a valuable resource in itself. So we developed a global data repository where FEAST users can upload the data from the data app, and it has generated a kind of database of standardized feed data from many different countries. And so I have to emphasize it's a byproduct really of applying the FEAST tool. It's not really our main aim, but it is a useful resource. And Simon and indeed Alap Mehta of the SEBI group have developed ways of visualizing that data. And Simon's going to talk about some of those visualizations today, and also some of the download facility capabilities of the data repository, I think. Anyway, let's hear what Simon has to say. That's all I have to say.
Great, thanks, Alan. And so if Vanessa, unless you want to chime in and continue the Master of Ceremony process.
Yeah, I wanted to actually, before we continue, to just pop up a quick poll. We're getting just a sense of who's here and what familiarity you have or what interests you have in all this. And the poll, I'll share the results. So you can see majority have not used the FEAST tool, a few have, and a few intend to, which is exciting. And then of the people who are here, there's a big cohort of people who are curious, which is great. A few people who feel they have data to share. 8 people want to collaborate, and 7 want to use FEAST data. So that's very interesting. Okay, I'll stop sharing that. And I will invite Simon to share his screen and continue. Thank you.
And that was really interesting to see. And I think really encouraging to see the interest in the data and also the interest in collaboration. That's great. Yeah, so I first was exposed to FEAST when I was desperately preparing for a participatory mapping exercise to be carried out in Lushoto, Tanzania. And the desperation was because there was such a dearth of feed data out there. And that dearth was only filled by the FEAST data that was out there. At the time, it was only available through reports. And those reports were harmonized, consistent, and provided a key set of graphs on feed availability, feed composition, as well as the rainfall patterns in the location. So for me, back in about 2014, that was a great primer for field work that I was doing. And that was just one example of how these data can be used. Although they're secondary, it's not the primary purpose of collecting these data. That's just an example of how these data can be used. And that's in terms of preparation and learning about a local context that you haven't yet worked in. So I'll be talking broadly about FEAST, but focusing on the FEAST Global Data Repository. And I think that focus is of interest to us all because it's where the data is available and it's free of charge and ready to go for us all at the moment. But I'll also keep in context the broader FEAST workflow and ecosystems of components. So just to recap on what Alan was saying there, what is FEAST? Well, it's specifically a 7-step process of identifying needs within a community and then developing plans to address those needs to improve livestock production. And the key components of that process are step 2 and 3, which involve a focus group discussion as well as individual farmer interviews. So it's these 2 steps where these data are generated. There's also a sense checking process after that, just to make sure what's entered into the data repository matches what's on the ground. But that's broadly the heart of FEAST itself, as well as the source of data for the global repository. And it is participatory in nature. It's really taking an opportunity that farmers otherwise wouldn't have to meet together, to focus on a set of issues and be prompted on a set of questions which may not come up at the local church or mosque or down at the market where they may meet. And there are key components to this structured set of discussions. And that's embedded within a broader ecosystem. So that broader ecosystem, as Alan talked through before, it's the focus group discussions and interview itself. It's fact sheets that can inform interventions once a rural community has decided what they do want to do, what their priorities are, and how they want to address those issues. And there is also, as part of this ecosystem, a way to standardize what is collected from those discussions and make that publicly available. So then focusing on those focus group discussions and interviews, what's in them? Let's have a closer look at that now and look at those components of these discussions. What do you get when you look at the global data repository? Well, in these interviews, they discuss, of course, their livestock holdings, what fodder they produce, their feed availability on a monthly basis, and not only their feed availability in absolute terms, also the composition of that feed and the relative scarcity between the months. Complementing those data, we also have information on labour, and that may be specific to a set of activities, and it may be gender disaggregated as well. And we have income, also gender disaggregated. We also have information on decision making, crop cultivation, and how crops are utilised, both in terms of what's grown and also how the residues are utilised. And that may be whether they're fed to livestock, whether they're sold, or just burnt. So in amongst all of these questions that are raised, the focus group discussion and interview comes to an end with a tech fit assessment. And that is bringing to the fore the core issues around feed in the locality. And that might be feed availability or feed seasonality or feed quality. and the participants will score those. And they'll also score some enabling factor environmental elements like labour availability, access to credit. And so these will help inform a rural community then in having the context to come to a common understanding, and then with the tech fit assessment, really bringing those priorities to the fore. And so then I just want to take a moment just for us all to reflect on how these discussions can catalyse change. Now, we have different farmers and sometimes extension officers and maybe some local government representatives in these discussions. And these, as I said previously, these are discussions and questions that may not have been asked previously. This is an opportunity. And so I want to take an opportunity just to write in the chat window there, where in your professional experience, where have you seen change in a rural community that otherwise wouldn't have come about if there wasn't a discussion had, if there wasn't a facilitated discussion? So I'll share a few stories while you do ponder, reflect, and share your stories in the chat there. And one that comes to mind is a story from James Rebank's English pastoralist book. And if those of you that aren't familiar with that book, it was written by a gentleman based up on a 80-hectare farm in the northwest of England. And as part of his reflections in his book, he recalls a time when he was sat down with an extension officer, for lack of a better term, and him and his father was very skeptical. But throughout that discussion, through a facilitated way, James Rebanks and his father decided to transform their farm, and they decided to fence off riparian zones. They decided to restore old fences that had deteriorated since the 1950s, and farm machinery had become bigger. And so this was a catalyst for change for James Rebanks. And this facilitated discussion has brought about change on his farm. So that's just one anecdote. And I can think of many more in rural communities that I've had discussions with in Kenya and Tanzania. So I can't see the chat there, but feel free to keep on thinking about that question and post in the chat throughout this presentation. So then focusing on the global data repository, again, this is our main interest. This is what you can access right now and make use of. It was first developed in 2016 with the view of having consistency of data and having those data open. Then in 2019, a gendered version of Feast was developed and released. And then in 2020, some legacy data was entered, and that was right across Sub-Saharan Africa. Some data from 2012 and prior was entered into the tool manually and then uploaded. And so then last year we went through a process of making some revisions to make the data more user-friendly, to improve some functionality and make the data repository more extendable. And specifically, we wanted to make it open source and move on from just having a dependency on one developer to then having some capacity across multiple developers and potentially yourselves to make contributions. So then let's have a closer look at this global repository. As you visit the Feast website, and I'll put that into the chat window at the end of the presentation, along with some other resources. But when you land on the page, you're presented with, of course, a login. We don't take any sensitive information, but we do want to manage who is accessing these data. And you also get a summary of what is in the data repository. So here we see there are 15 countries represented, with 176 sites, and across those sites there are 289 focus group discussions that have been had, and in total 774 fodder hectares have been enumerated. So if I do a live demo here, we'll just have a quick exploration of what's in the repository. So then, coming to the global repository, you can, of course, navigate your own way. But starting at the visualizations, we can first see a map of sites. Where has FEAST been implemented, and how many studies have been done within a particular country, and within a particular study, what production system is that classified as, and is there a report associated with that study? And so in this case, we can view this study and read that in detail. And this is a particular one from Burkina Faso in 2019. And here, sorry, just if you bear with me, we can come back to the global repository here, and we can visit the download section. And of course, always in a live demo, we have timeout issues. So coming to the download section, I think this will be of most interest to you all. This is where you can access the data either in its entirety or access subsections by region. You can also choose the data format that you want to download, and that may be an R data format or Excel or CSV. So here you can play with that yourselves, but here I'll just quickly explore with you some of the key tables within the global data repository. And then we'll look at the visualizations that Alan was mentioning previously. So here we have a summary of the sites. On this page, we have useful information in terms of the georeferenced site location and the country. Moving in a greater level of detail there, we can look at specific focus group discussions and then start to see how many people were in that focus group discussion, what the land size ranges were within that focus group discussion, and other basic information about the focus group discussion. And also we have georeferenced site information for specific focus group discussions. Then I think specific interest to members in this call will be the feed source availability, giving feed availability on a monthly basis broken down by feed source. So that might be leguminous crop residues, cereal crop residues, or concentrate feeds, or fodder trees. We also have information on labour division. And if we take a quick look at some of those activities that are in there, we see that there are activities around preparing land for planting forages, or weeding, or harvesting. Then looking at a gender-specific version, well, let's take Vietnam for this case. If we take a gendered implementation of FEAST, we can also view the feed labour division and see who the main contributor to that labour effort is. So that's an example of the gendered component of FEAST. Now moving on to the visualizations, we can see the great work that Alep and LD4D did in preparing some of these visualizations. And again, we have a summary of the sites, and we can see this availability data that I was talking about earlier on a specific site basis. And this is just showing the absolute feed. And we can also hover above and see the breakdown for that particular location within a particular month. So here, cereal crop residues is the main feed source in January, and that's in Ghana here. We also have information on feed sources across the months. And again, in starting with the Democratic Republic of Congo, we see grazing is the dominant resource right across the year, and concentrates are brought in between May and November. So that's an example of really digging into that feed availability data. In terms of the residue utilization data, we can see a very nice snapshot on a country level of how those different feed resources are used, how those different crop residues are used. We do also have this by crop species, but this is averaged across all species. So for example, we see in Burkina Faso, 91% of crop residues are fed. And I say that with some caveats. This isn't nationally representative data. This is across the sites that have been sampled. So there will be some biases there. Then in terms of crop residues themselves, again, we have another breakdown of residue utilization by how it's used, and you can compare two different locations. And similarly, crop forage area, we can see what those specific forages are. So let's choose perhaps a more interesting location here. And we can choose here where we have Bermuda grass, Napier grass, and Calliandra, which are novel photospecific species there. And we also have the crop residues, or the crops themselves may also be used as whole feed. And that brings us to the end of the live demonstration there. So I'll swap back to the slides to share a bit more about what's to come and some related work that has come out from the usage of this residual data. So I hope you can all see my slides there. And just to share a bit about what we have on the horizon, we'll be developing new visualizations to integrate some of the work that ALIP have done and previous work in terms of developing standardized presenting formats, and we'll be integrating that into the global repository. We'll also be integrating more spatial features, so you can map out exactly where these data are collected from. And that is useful in terms of mapping this with other spatialized data. And we expect to have this implemented by the end of the year. And we're, as I said previously, we're implementing this in an open source fashion. And that means that we can cultivate this culture of extendability, that we can continually develop these tools, and we can make them more relevant to you. So that's available on GitHub, the code that was developed originally and developed on last year. And then a bit more about how these data have been used. And Alan provided a bit of a caveat that these data aren't collected for the purpose of analysis. It is a byproduct of a data generating process for decision making. And so that is very context specific. And part of that context is that there is some scoring that is done that is relative to that context. So a scoring of 10 in one location won't be the same as another location. It's relative to their particular history. So with those caveats, we have been using these data for ground truth, as well as training points for spatializing metrics to then use to identify feed constraints across East Africa, and also identify enabling environment aspects. And they're the aspects that I mentioned previously around labour and credit and the like. So these figures that you see on the screen here are just two example outputs that we've produced from that analysis. And the one on the left will be presented at the International Grasslands Rangelands Conference later this year. And that's identifying where there is variability in feed availability across East Africa. So then you see, say, in central Tanzania, we have high variability in feed availability, and similarly in northern Ethiopia. And this is less so the case in Rwanda and Burundi. Then on the figure on the right-hand side, we see a conceptual example of how we can then progress from these identification of constraints to then perhaps identifying technologies that could be implemented in specific locations. So this is taking the example of dual-purpose legumes, and through a process of expert stakeholder engagement, this particular feed intervention has been identified as a potential for improving feed quantity as 3 out of 5, and a potential for addressing feed quality as 3 out of 5. And it's seen as having some requirements, and they're listed at the bottom there. And each of those requirements have a score. So then this is, again, a conceptual example of if we take spatialized metrics of land, water, labor, and other aspects, and attributes of a particular feed intervention, it's asking the question, can we then spatialize where these feed technologies will be suitable? Can we develop feed feasibility surfaces? So then with that one example of how these data are being used, I'll share a bit about what my views are of potential extensions of the feast ecosystem are. And then I'll really look forward to opening up to a broader discussion. And also I'll look forward to seeing what you've posted in the chats. So here we see two examples of where I think we need to go to from here. Now, I think the focus group discussions need to become more spatially explicit. And this is coming from my experience of gathering stakeholders around maps and then really being confronted with differences of opinion of what is occurring in that landscape, and working through those differences of opinion to come to a consensus. And through that process, having a much richer action plan on what needs to be done in that locality. And also, I think it can provide some greater context for local stakeholders, where we can draw in existing spatial data to inform their decision making, and that may be using Earth observation data to identify rainfall patterns, and that can provide a basis for further discussion. And then it may mean that these data are more useful for producing reliable subnational feed baskets, because we know exactly where these focus group discussions are referring to. So then we can link that back with other spatial covariates to make spatial predictions on a broader scale. Then on the second point there is we have a wealth of data in this global repository already, and some of those metrics that are collected are subjective. There's just no way of getting around that, and we want them to be subjective. But we may be able to standardize those estimates based on existing spatial data. and there that may be taking the seasonality trends that are identified within the focus group discussions, but scaling them based on Earth observation data. So they're just two examples of future work that I see, and I'll look forward to hearing the future work that you have in mind.
Thanks, Simon. Is it
Thank you.
okay to, perfect, just on time. Thank you very much for that, Simon. That was really detailed, and I think there was a lot of interest. There were a few messages in the chat, and I think what we'll do is we'll just maybe do a quick response and then go directly into breakouts so we can make the most of that time. So there was a question from Mahmoud saying, it looks like a great and simple tool. What about updates over time? How frequently do you think the data behind the tools for different locations needs to be updated?
Yeah, and this is based on a as needs basis. So some communities may choose to revisit their plans and conduct a feast again, but that continuity over time is only on an as needs basis.
Great. Okay. With that, I think we can prepare to break out into 3 discussion groups to explore uses and future developments for this data. So a quick note, the breakout groups will be facilitated by Simon, by Alan Duncan, and also there's one of their colleagues here, Ben Lukuyu. And so if you just bear with me for one moment, I'll pop you in the groups. The groups will discuss the same questions, namely, what uses do we see for this data? How can we leverage this data to combine it with other data to expand the coverage? What could be some future priorities in terms of developing the database, such as gender or spatial aspects? And are you aware of other data sources we could tap into around feed baskets? So it's quite open-ended. But it's a chance to get into some smaller groups and explore some of those things. So with that, I will just get you into those groups. One moment. Welcome back, everyone. Just a few people left trickling back from the breakout groups. I think we probably could have spent another 45 minutes just on those discussions. I think they were getting into some rich territory. Okay, so thanks everyone for participating in the breakout groups. I think there were some good discussions, and we can do a very quick round of maybe just two key points that came out. So I'll start. I was in a breakout group with Simon, and so there was some acknowledgement that the gender dimensions, the gender data is quite useful. Obviously, there are some limitations, but the respondent-specific data, which is gender disaggregated, is going to be useful for analysis and for potential follow-up work. There were some interesting offers of sharing data from Indonesia, and there was a suggestion if a visualization could be developed to sort of see potential forages or potential feeds based on different locations. So I'm looking at farmers, livestock keepers that are working near forests versus other kinds of areas, and to understand what is used in some locations and not others. So I'll just leave that there and invite someone from the other breakout groups to jump in and give a very quick roundup.
So I was in room 1 with Ben. We had a good chat. There was a lot of interest about where FEAST had been implemented by local institutes, and the mention of master trainers in local institutes, and some sharing of contact points to follow up on that. And then also from the global perspective, there was looking at global forage and fodder maps, how FEAST resources could be used to kind of triangulate and ground check, check what these global maps are saying at the local context. But yeah, I think we could have gone on longer. So thanks, Vanessa. Over back to you.
Thanks, Gareth. And the final person, I think, Cara, will you report back from the third group?
Yeah, sure, Vanessa. So we had a good chat. Alan was asked a few questions. We also touched on gender as well, came up on our group. We touched about where the data come from, the updates and that timeliness of that data, and also in general how we work with that integrated with other data sets. And generally it was just everybody found it a really useful tool, and how it could be widened to other countries as well. So yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks so much. So to close, I'll just put Simon's details on the screen. If you want to follow up, please go ahead and get in touch with him. There's also the link to the FEAST website where you can get through to all the resources. Thanks for participating. This has been the second LD4D summer session. There are quite a few more in the pipeline, 5 more in the next 2 weeks. Don't miss them. And just a quick preview of what is going on next week. We have 3 sessions. On the 10th, which is Tuesday, the Last Mile mobile app for managing animal health projects in Africa. That's via GalvMed and Boehringer Ingelheim. On Wednesday, we have an exclusive product overview and demo from Google with their new product, Google Taskmate, which is for crowdsourcing data collection. That was just announced today, so hopefully people can join for that. And on Thursday, we're going to hear about the use of satellite imagery to do the first cattle survey in South Sudan in 50 years. So that should be quite exciting. There's more on the website. Please do register for any that you're interested in. And just a final point, if you want to stay in touch with LD4D and get news about future events or updates, visit livestockdata.org. We also have data, visualizations, resources, and more, including the FEAST visualizations. You can sign up to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, and of course, email us. So with that, I close the session. I thank you all for your interest, and we hope to see you again soon. All right, bye.